So, sir, you've obviously spent a lot of time down here today. Overnight, you were out here experiencing and seeing what really is happening along our southern border. So, day one down here in Yuma, what is your takeaway?
I have a whole kind of confluence of impressions about what I saw. I mean, starting last night, it was like a dystopian nightmare with, all of these desperate people flooding across the wall in a situation that clearly could have been prevented. And people from all over the world, from Africa, from Uzbekistan, from Senegal, from Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Nepal, Tibet, India, Bangladesh, Peru, Colombia. We saw all of these people, and these hundreds of people coming across the wall. And it seems so hopeless. And then meeting all of the people of Yuma, the leadership, this extraordinary leadership in this amazing town, the people who run the hospitals, the people who run the border clinic, the sheriff, and all of these other people at the food banks who are working as hard as they can to accommodate the problem, a problem that was created by the federal government, that local people are being, forced to hold the bag on. We talked to the hospital administrator who spent $23 million last year that is unreimbursed or caring for migrants and are giving migrants the same level of care with the same priority that they treat people who are their relatives in the town. So it's this extraordinary, it's kind of the best part of America and the worst part at the same time.
And you're seeing all of these entities kind of struggling to keep up and to just continue on and serving the community. You mentioned that this could have been prevented. How do you mean, and what do you mean by that?
Well, I think the federal government at one point 3 years ago made a dramatic pivot in how to handle this. And we saw, I mean, everybody testified to this, Democrats and Republicans. So it wasn't a partisan issue. But during the initial part of the Biden administration, there was a signal sent, probably inadvertently, but for partisan reasons. A lot of the sensors were torn up. The lamp towers were torn up, and a lot of the infrastructure that was designed to keep people out was disabled for one reason or another. And then a signal was sent to the world that the gate was open. And at that point, it became a business proposition for the cartels, and it's become a multi-billion-dollar business every month of smuggling people across. And so now, and I think one of the other things that happened is there wasn't attention paid to the President of the United States, to our relationships with Mexico and the Central American countries, where this flow could have been stopped if there was cooperation among the nations. So none of those things were attended to. The good news for me, Ali, is that there's a solution. And everybody here that we talked to, when I asked them, can this be solved, they all said, absolutely. So, that gives me a lot of hope.
What are the things, obviously you're out here kind of on a recon mission to kind of learn the best practices that we can put in place as a nation to secure the border and also tend to the humanitarian crisis as well. So what are some of those takeaways from like the retired Border Patrol chief that you talked with, from the sheriff, people who have boots on the ground? What are some takeaways that you would consider implementing should you become president?
Well, I think there are physical obstructions. There are, for example, I think that, everybody agrees that you need a wall in certain areas, particularly very heavily populated areas. You need the physical wall. And those sections that are incompleted need to be completed in those areas. In the more rural areas, we need good surveillance. We need ground sensing. We need, we need all of the different, the plethora of different surveillance techniques. We need support for the border guards so that they feel, that their morale is raised. They need to be taken off of the duty of caring for the migrants and really patrolling the border and stopping the flow. And we need regulatory policies that allow us to process migrants, legitimate migrants, people who really do can seek asylum as quickly as possible and as humanely as possible, to deport the ones who are not legitimate. And then we need to really pay attention to our relationships with Mexico and the other Central Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Panama to enlist their aid in what should be a universal project to stop the flow of immigrants up the isthmus.
And obviously, we're seeing a flow of immigrants still coming in. With the policies, with Title VIII, if that policy was enforced as it's written, it would require detention. This administration has been very open and honest that they do not desire detention, specifically for family units. Where do you stand on detaining migrants that cross over?
I think we need detention. And the reason for that is, and I understand the impulse of the administration is that detention is inhumane. But what we're doing now is much more inhumane because of the suspension of the detention policy. It has become an invitation to other people to take this huge risk to try to get into this country because it's an open door. It's a signal that it's an open door. And that puts them in the power. That puts millions of people, 7 million people have crossed in the last 3 years. Our country cannot sustain that. There's veterans who are homeless in this country. There are 57% of Americans can't put their hands on $1,000 if there's an emergency. We're cutting food stamps in our country to hungry families. Our social service systems in this country cannot take the flow. There's inhumanity there, but most of all, the migrants themselves are being put at the mercy of the cartels, and they're suffering from extortion, from exploitation, exploitation, from beatings, from rapes, from murders, from robberies, and the really horrendous problem of the abuse of children. And that's all happening because we suspended the detention policy.
With that being said, the cartels, obviously every lawmaker and individual along the southern border will say they're in control. What is your stance on the cartel? Would you consider labeling them as terrorists, or what's your stance there?
I think that's something that we can do. I think we can, I think that we need to sit down with Mexico. We need to do a lot of work on restoring our relationships with Mexico, good relationships with Mexico and the other Central American countries. We really abandoned those countries in 2001, and it was a series of administrations that did that. And our relationships with those nations has gone south ever since. And, if I'm elected president, I'm going to really focus on restoring goodwill in those countries toward the United States and a working relationship to stop the flow of immigration.
And it is going to take a village, right? Now, sir, I do have to ask a couple of questions, not about the border. If you don't want to answer, I understand, but I wouldn't be a journalist if I didn't ask. There was another mass shooting in Virginia today. Obviously, your stance on mass shootings has been one that has drawn some criticism. You have talked about the pharmaceutical industry being responsible for these mass shootings. What is your take now today? This one was in Virginia. I believe 2 people were killed. Do you maintain that stance that it is the pharmaceutical companies, the industry that is driving these mass shootings?
Well, I never said that, but I said that's something that we need to look into. We need to do those studies, and NIH has been blocking those studies for many, many years. And we don't have any good studies that tell whether or not there's a lot of suspicions that SSRIs and benzos, in particularly, and other psychiatric drugs may be linked to the shootings. And when you think about these shootings, you think about why this is something that never happened before in history. There's never been a time in history when people would walk into a room of children and start killing them, people or strangers. It doesn't happen in other countries. And other countries, including countries that have as many guns as we do per capita, for example, Switzerland. And in Switzerland, the last mass shooting they had was 21 years ago. We have one every 21 hours. And if you look at these psychiatric drugs, they, virtually all of them say on the manufacturer's insert, suicidal and homicidal ideation. So it's logical to look at those and figure out, we take more psychiatric drugs than any country in the world. We take 3 or 4 times the amount of medications as any of the European countries. We have the highest chronic disease rates of those countries, and we're the only country where this is happening. And we have to figure out we've had guns throughout our history. And really, prior to the introduction of Prozac, mass shootings were almost unknown. There'd been a few of them. But now ever since then, they've become very, very common. And that doesn't prove that, these drugs are doing it. Correlation is not causation. But it's certainly something we should be looking into, and NIH has refused to do that.
So is the focus more on in that space than it would be on gun control, banning those kinds of?
Well, I mean, I'm just realistic and pragmatic about gun control. First of all, right now, I don't think is a good time in history when there's such polarization in our country and so many people are fearful about these incursions against the Constitution that have happened, unprecedented incursions over the past 3 years. To tell people now you're going to go and take away their guns. Second of all, I think it just is going to amplify the polarization. And, we've been talking about gun control for 30, 40 years, and it hasn't worked. So we better think of something else. We better start thinking of different options. Second of all, the Supreme Court in recent years has given a very expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment, so that it just is unconstitutional to do anything but kind of a gun control at the very margins. And anybody who tells you that that is going to solve the problem is pulling your leg. We're never going to get to the place where Western Europe is, where they just restrict guns so they don't, and that's one of the reasons there's no gun violence in those countries. We'll never get there. The guns are part of American, particularly the rural culture in our country. It's integrated into it, and there's people who feel that it's a very, very important constitutional right, and so we need to think of ways to actually reduce the killings of our children. And if we have to, I will armor our schools the way that we do airports. I don't want any more children to die. And, my father was killed by guns. My uncle was killed by a gun. I understand the anguish of Americans whose lives and children have been robbed from them, and family members have been robbed from them by gun violence. But I need to be a practical political leader and not overpromise things that nobody can deliver, but actually look for ways to solve this problem that may be thinking out of the box. And one of those is to look at SSRIs. The other is to do what we need to do to armor our schools.
In some ways that this administration may be over-delivering would be potentially in the way that they are assisting in Ukraine to some people. What is your stance on the war with Ukraine that's ongoing and the munitions package that we're getting ready to send on top of the billions that have already been sent?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Ukraine war, I think we went to the Ukraine war for all the right reasons. The Americans supported it because we're a compassionate nation. Vladimir Putin made it illegal and brutal an unnecessary invasion of the Ukraine. My son went over there to fight on the side of the Ukrainians. He was a machine gunner in a special forces unit during the Kharkiv offensive. And, so I have huge sympathy for the Ukrainian people, but the Ukrainian people are victims not only of Vladimir Putin, but of U.S. geopolitical machinations by a group of people in the White House called the neocons, who have another agenda, which is in the Ukraine war. And President Biden has been very frank about this. He said his objective in the Ukraine war is regime change of Vladimir Putin. And his Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, has said the U.S. objective in the Ukraine war is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. Well, that's not a humanitarian mission, and that is not a good thing for the Ukraine. And so far, in that endeavor, we have killed 350,000 Ukrainian kids and maybe 100,000 Russians, which we shouldn't be happy about. We could have avoided this war easily The Russians made it very clear that the one thing they wanted is that we withdraw the threat to move our threat to move NATO into the Ukraine, and and we refused to negotiate with them. So we need to, we've caught this poor country in a proxy war between two great powers for purposes that are we have to stop thinking in terms of the comic book depictions that they try to propagandize us with, which is this is good against evil. There's, the U.S. has been involved in a series of provocations going back to 2014 and before. And, we need to take responsibility for that, and we need to settle this war as quickly as possible and stop the bloodshed.